You're listening to a Hebrew in Israel podcast with Yoel Halevi, exploring the language, culture, and history of the Bible. For more information, visit us at HebrewInIsrael.net.
Shalom everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Hebrew in Israel Haftarah series. I'm your host, Yoel Halevi. And we are reading the Haftarah for Parashat Vayiqra this week. Last week's recording didn't really go exactly according to the recordings that are supposed to be in order, in the sense of reading from one specific verse to a specific verse, because I'd already done a recording in the past on the Prayer of Solomon, so I prefer to use that one instead of making another recording, because there are time constraints that I have to deal with all the time. If I can substitute a recording with something that I already made, even if it's not perfectly exactly like what's supposed to be read for the Haftarah, but it covers that material, I would use it. Even though I haven't made too many of those, there are a few here and there. This is why last week's reading may have not been exactly on the spot of the reading. Like, for example, some readings go from 1 Kings 1, 740 to 750, which is a really, really short reading. I actually went with another reading that based itself more on the idea of 1 Kings 751 all the way to 821. That was what I was basing myself off of, but it wasn't exactly that reading. Because the Prayer of Solomon is a very, very long segment, and I wanted to touch on a whole bunch of things that appear in that song, I preferred to use a recording that I pre-made in one of my classes, and use that one because it's always a better stage. Usually in the actual classes, also questions come up, and it makes it much more intriguing. So I touched on some things that would have not come out if it wasn't for the fact that I had students listening to the class. Which, to remind everyone, I do offer a Bible class, which by this point should be in the book of Deuteronomy. I pre-record all these recordings, and we should already be in the book of Deuteronomy. This is a one class once a week, very simple. I use the Hebrew text, but I also translate. I explain some of the grammar. I explain some issues that can happen. I try to interpret what things might mean. Obviously, there is a bit of an open discussion sometimes when there is time to allow expression of other opinions, but the class itself is mostly led by me. Not expensive. You can bring your family in to listen to this recorded into this class, and there are more details on my website, HebrewInIsrael.net. And for those who keep on emailing me about Hebrew classes, I'm usually fully booked. I do basically a lot of things throughout the week overall, and I have limited time slots. So if you are interested, you will have to drop me an email at HebrewInIsrael@gmail.com and just basically wait. But it's worth the wait because I am academically trained. I have years of experience in the field, and the classes work based on your abilities, what you want to do, and it doesn't matter what level you're on. You can actually start from complete zero to people already in the middle, and even very advanced people sometimes take classes with me. In those cases, I have to adjust the class specifically for the person, but there is a curriculum, and you can just basically communicate with me and hear what I have to offer. But I do have to point out that the study is based on academic way of studying, which means very systematic. And we do discuss more historical aspects of the language as well. And I do teach you the mechanism so you can also do a lot of things by yourself. This is one of the things that I promote highly with my students, is that you learn how to learn, not just, here's a textbook, start reading. No, this is not like a university course where you have a semester or two to finish an entire curriculum and so on. No, I teach you how to learn. Usually university courses are too fast. Other courses out there are sometimes offered by people who are less professional, or people who are trying to use a strictly academic mechanism. We work based on semesters. Here, it's in your own pace, dealing with your own difficulties. I've told people who have dyslexia. I've told people who take longer to pick up on things. I've also told people who pick up on things really fast. I've had students who finish things very, very quickly. But it's basically the main key point is that it's in your pace. But now to our discussion here. So what I'm going to be reading here from is I'm going to be using the longer reading that we have here, which starts in Isaiah 43:21 all the way to 44:23. So it's a relatively long reading. It's a very, very interesting reading in overall because it's extremely monotheistic. But if we try to read between the lines here, we also understand why it's so monotheistic. And this is where the academia kind of plays in here. There are obviously sections in the book of Isaiah which date to a date that deals with parts of exile. I've touched on this before in the past because Isaiah is a very, very large book and highly debated. And Isaiah does contain segments where we can obviously see, I personally think it's very obvious. But it's very dangerous to use the word obvious if you don't prove how it's obvious. But there's no time to have a whole discussion about the book of Isaiah. In truth, entire courses are dedicated just to teach the book of Isaiah because it's a very complicated book with a lot of history inside it. I personally wrote a paper that took me over 3 months to write just on a section in the history of King Isaiah. And how about the prophet Isaiah and the kings he had to deal with, specifically King Ahaz. That, by the way, that paper is available online for those who can read Hebrew. I wrote it as part of my partial fulfillment of requirements of a bachelor's in a Bachelor's of Arts in History and Biblical Studies. This was specifically targeting the Book of Kings. I am currently working on another very, very large research paper about the Book of Kings, but it also deals with some other matters that will also come out in Hebrew. Hopefully one day I'll be able to translate these papers because they were considered to be very, very good. And Isaiah himself lives in a period where there is exile. The problem that we have is there's always the question of who's the addressee here. There was, for example, a theory that said that there were students of Isaiah. So this came from the school of Isaiah. And this is why this all falls under the category of Isaiah, even though it might not necessarily come from Isaiah himself. And there are people who object to this. For example, I think it was Yecheskel Kaufman who strongly objected to this idea, and he says, look, there's no real evidence of this. And that's really usually how it works. You have people presenting ideas, people rebuttaling, and really, in truth, nothing is 100%. I once shared a video about something, and someone said, oh, yeah, you can watch the whole movie. And it was basically a documentary about the Exodus. And there was a big question that came up with one of the people who were discussing this with me, and they said, well, there's no actual evidence. And that's really the thing. In research, sometimes, in research which is more in the humanities, it's very difficult to find absolute evidence unless you find something concrete like an original copy of the book of Isaiah with Isaiah's signature in the end, his stamp on it, and so on, and we can prove 100% that this dates back to the period of Isaiah. It's very difficult to prove anything. And also there's the very long, complicated discussion about the composition of the Bible, how we got the Bible that we have, and really, in truth, what was the state of the books in earlier stages, what they were in latter stages, and so on. And the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls opened that whole subject up. Also, for example, a very classic discussion is the variations. For example, the book of Jeremiah. There's a Jeremiah scroll. It's much, much shorter than the Jeremiah that we have, which might be an abbreviation of the original book, might be an earlier stage. There's a lot we can speculate here. Same thing with Isaiah. Isaiah has interesting traits. There's a very obvious switch in I would say, some elements of style and language between the first part of Isaiah and the second part of Isaiah. And there's actually been attempts to try to produce programs that analyze the differences between these sections. I actually have a professor who tried to use one of these programs to create an analysis of different parts of the book of Job to see if there's a real linguistic difference there. Unfortunately, it didn't work. There was something glitchy with the program, but hopefully these programs will get better. And the thing is that when you read Isaiah in Hebrew, and you read it as one long swoop, which I've done multiple times, you do feel the switch. The atmosphere becomes a little bit different, and therefore it's much easier to see through the Hebrew text that there's a change in who is really speaking here. Now, I still hold that there's a strong connection here to Isaiah. I don't automatically accept everything I hear from academics, because there's always, there's a question mark. Well, it's a good thing there's a question mark. If it wasn't for human curiosity, we wouldn't achieve what we achieve. However, the fact that someone found a question mark doesn't mean that the question mark is the final thing that can exist, and there can be sometimes eventually discoveries that help us understand things better. Like, for example, just now, a couple months ago, a new book came out. I only remember one of the writers, because he's a writer that I've followed throughout the years, Jan Houston, who is a European scholar. I can never remember exactly where he's from, but he might be one of the Swedish or something like that. If not, I apologize to him. I'm not too sure exactly where he's from. And he wrote a book together with another scholar, How Old is the Bible?, where they're actually dealing with the question of linguistic dating of the biblical text. And this book is actually a response to a different book that came out back, I think, in 2008 or 2009, that tried to say that, look, we can prove that the Bible is much later. It was very much later, and he tries. The writers actually produced 2 volumes. Second volume is mostly references and stuff like that. It was very surprising when I got the book. I was looking at 2/3 of the second volume was mostly the references and the bibliography and stuff like that. But what they try to do there is they try to prove that the biblical text cannot be dated as being a very early text, and they try to push it to be late, and so on. But there's always new discoveries. I was seeing, for example, in a class, and they said, look, one of the premises that people use that argue the Bible's not that old is because we can't really prove that there was literacy. And suddenly, 30 years later or 20 years later, someone discovers writings, and there is written material from earlier periods that earlier research they thought was different. So there's a lot that's always discovered all the time. So again, the one thing a friend of mine once said to me, one very important thing, was that, look, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have the Great Isaiah Scrolls. It's obviously been one book for a very, very long time. The question is, how exactly did the book come into our hands? And that's actually a question that, unfortunately, I think we can't even 100% answer. I'm currently dealing with this specific question with the book of Deuteronomy. I'm writing a research paper about the book of Deuteronomy, something pretty complicated, required me to dive into a lot of literature, and even though I thought I was done, more ideas came flowing in. And that's really the process of research. The process of research basically requires you to think and look at as many possibilities as you can. I actually asked one of my professors, I said to him, what do you expect? And he says, how much do you want? He says, whatever's necessary. Whatever is necessary for the discussion, you have to dive into and look. I proposed a 6 months process of writing this paper. I got a funny look from my professor. You know what? I understand the funny look now. In truth, real research takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of work to produce high quality research. And the problem is that when someone dedicates a few months to a research, you're only dealing with preliminary research. You're not dealing with something big. So in the preliminary reading that I've done throughout the years on the book of Isaiah, and I might actually be taking a course in the book of Isaiah next year. We'll see. It was suggested. But they never finalize the curriculum until they know exactly what they're doing. But it'll be very interesting to take a course in the book of Isaiah. It's one of the more complicated books in the Bible. And the thing that usually you read is that they say there's at least 2 stages of the book of Isaiah. This is standard. standard analysis of the book based on a lot of different points. One of the points is an historical point where we actually hear a reference to exile. My contention with this argument is that the stages of exile of Israel started very, very early on. And we don't see here in the text anything that specifies that he's talking specifically about the exile of Judah. This could be the destruction of them. We have to remember that in the year, by the year 720 and 721, 720 BCE, the entire northern kingdom was more or less destroyed. By several decades later, Judea was being eaten through. By a point that around the year 701, most of Judea was destroyed. And this is why when people talk about, oh, look, he's talking about exile, we have to understand the exile started very, very early on, already somewhere in the second half of the 8th century BCE. And therefore, when the prophet talks about exile, we can't exactly pinpoint what part of the exile he's talking about, because the exile was something that something that was going on over several centuries. It started somewhere around the 8th century, went into, and more or less kind of ended. The process ended in the year 586, as usually expressed in academic circles, 586 BCE, when the first temple was destroyed. The land was not emptied out, and that's another very interesting subject that I've talked about a little bit here and there. One of the scholars to really look into this is Lipschitz. He actually has made a video. You can actually look up on YouTube. Unfortunately, his English is not great, and it's a little difficult to listen to him speak in English, but he has written extensively about this subject. It is accepted practice today in historical biblical studies circles. I've studied it as common practice to understand that the land was not empty, and there were plenty of the 10 tribes, and basically all tribes still lived here. There were still pieces of them left. Their political identity was destroyed. And then we have the wars of the Second Temple of identity and the Holy See in the Book of Ezra and Nehemiah and so on. Which, by the way, leads to the conclusion that Jews today are actually descendants of all 12 tribes. And there are sections of the 10 tribes which are scattered somewhere, but Jews today are actually composed from a larger composition, and the term Jew was only given because of Judea and the province of Judea, and has absolutely nothing to do with Jews as being Jews from Judah. Because, for example, I'm a Levite. I'm not really Judah. I'm a Levite. It's a different tribe. There were also parts of Benjamin, parts of Shimon or Simon, and so on. There were people. The Bible itself describes that parts of the northern tribes joined King Hezekiah, so there was an affiliation there. There were people who affiliated themselves with the community of Jerusalem during times of Nehemiah, so it's much more complicated. On the other hand, for example, Samaritans, what's very amusing to some degree, is Samaritans always talk about the idea that they're descendants of the 10 tribes, and it's not true. They're actually mostly descendants of Judeans, and specifically priests. Specifically, there were priestly families who moved to Samaria to live there and establish a temple there under one of the Sanvelats. There were like 7 or 8 of them. One of the Sanvelats, Josephus actually recalls this piece of history. So what's very interesting here in this prophecy, now to drag it back into our discussion, is that he never specifies Judah. You don't really get in the language that he's specifically talking about Judah. He only refers to Jacob and Israel, which means that he's not talking to any specific group, which means that he might be talking to everyone. He's much more, Israel still has its identity. Now, this is a really important statement, because if Israel still has its identity, if we go back into the El Yehudu inscriptions, or Tel Yehud, or Tel Yehudu, whatever name people want to use for it, this is a site where they discovered loads of inscriptions that contain Israelite names, Jewish names. The earlier stages of the people who lived there still bared Jewish names or Israelite names, what's known as Yahwistic names, or Yahu names, and so on. And they were obviously still identifying with who they were, which means they weren't really lost. What happened is 2-3 generations down the road, we start seeing names which are not really Israelite. And the same thing, by the way, happens with Jews who live in diaspora today. For example, Jews who've lost a bit of their identity, now they're called John and whatever, and Peter, and whatever. I'm using New Testament names, but kind of that's basically the direction of people basically using names which are not necessarily identified as Jewish names, even though it doesn't mean that they're not Jewish. They're just using names which were common back then in the other communities. But what's very important here is they still knew that they were Israelites. Now that means that maybe based on that, I can actually date at least part of these prophecies to a period where these exiles still knew who they were, which means that when he refers to Yaakov and Israel, as he does here in the parallels, for example, of 44:1, he's not talking just about Judah, he's talking about all of them, which means they still know who they are, which means we're still somewhere in the vicinity of the time of Isaiah. It is possible to date it that way, even though I know most scholars would completely disagree with me. So, now what we need to do is we have to start reading, because this is a relatively long reading, so we have to get into this because I don't want the recording to be too long. And for those wondering, by the way, this is basically the style of how I teach in overall. I mentioned earlier the Bible class. I usually do an introduction, any background information you might need, and then I go into the text and explain things. I actually find this method much more useful, especially as a trained historian. I think that background is always important before you enter a piece of information, so you actually understand what you're looking at. Unfortunately, we live in a reality where there's instant information, and you don't always know the background of why something is the way it is. And it's not uncommon for people to completely misunderstand a situation, even in everyday life, because you don't know what the background is. So this is how I always operate. This is standard with me. Okay, so he starts off with start off with the verse of the previous chapter, verse 21 of the previous chapter, which, by the way, does actually end a segment, but really the division of the chapters is sometimes very problematic. It stops in the middle of a thought and things like that. But here specifically, we're reading from a previous segment that actually does have a stop. If you look at a scroll, you'll see that there's a stop there. There's a spacing between the different sections. That's usually how you know you've reached an end point in a scroll. And he says, verse 21, Amzu yatzarti li tehilati yasaperu. Okay, so he says, this nation which I've created, or the people I formed for myself, that they might declare my praise. So tehilati is my praise, and he's basically saying, look, your purpose is to represent me and to glorify me, not to do other things. I chose you to be my people, to be, and this is how it links to the book of Vayiqra, Mamlechet Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. It doesn't mean that everyone is a priest. What it means is like being a priest, being chosen, being separated. It doesn't mean that you've become holier than thou. It doesn't mean that you can do whatever you want. But what it does mean is that you've been chosen. And I've spoken multiple times about the issue of being chosen also means you have responsibility. So what's this for us? Responsibility to bring honor to God. This is where he said, to declare my praise. Declaring God's praise is not just by singing hallelujah and stuff like that, but it's actually talking about declaring, saying, look, he did this, he did that. And he points out, he says, you're my witnesses later on. He says this. But it says, Velo oti karata Yaakov, velo yagata ki yagata bi Israel. But you have not worshipped me, you have not called out to me. I don't like the translation worship. I'm actually using a translation here because some of the language here is a little bit difficult. So some translations might say worship. I don't like using the term worship because it's very confusing. There are cases where it means to bow down, and cases where it means to praise, and different things. If we talk about telati esaperu, to tell my praise, then karata should also relate to the idea of to call out to. So you have not called out to me, which also means you haven't leaned upon me. For ki agata bi Israel. Now, some translations say that you should be wary of me, O Israel. There's a question here if the key here should be translated as that. I would actually translate, you have not called me. However, what you have done is you've made me weary. You have made me weary, Israel. So I would disagree with some translations. And this is one of the difficulties of the word ki. It's one of those words that has more than one meaning. It says but what he's actually saying here is that he's saying to them, if you feel, another way of reading this is that if you feel weary of me, you have to understand the following. So the problem here is that when you have to read everything as one long swoop to really understand the way a word is used. So for example, here, ki agata b'Israel can be of two different types. I said, however, you've behaved as if you're weary of me, or that you have made me weary. Now, when you read on, and I'm looking at it, this is always the issue. You read a verse and then you have to read the rest. Then you see, okay, wait, what he means is something else. So now we can translate correctly. That's always the danger of translating word for word. What does it really translates? For I have not made you weary. Why? Lo heveta li se'olatecha. This is verse 23. Lo heveta li se'olatecha uzvachecha lo chibatani. You have not brought to me the sheep, the sheep of your burnt offering, and your sacrifices. With your sacrifice, you have not honored me. Lo evaticha bemincha velo ga'aticha belvona. I have not made you labor with a grain offering, and I have not made you weary with frankincense. This is how you link it. Relates to ki yagata b'Yisrael. Now we know, based on this verse, what the previous verse actually means. And this is the difficulty with poetry and sometimes reading things in context. It says, but it continues, Lo kanita li v'kesef kaneh, you have no bought from me with money kaneh. Now, by the way, kaneh is sometimes referred to as kaneh bosem. And unfortunately, someone has been arguing that it means cannabis. And unfortunately, this is not true. Kaneh bosem is actually well known to us. It's a spice that was used as a type of incense. Has nothing to do with cannabis. Cannabis was not imported to this area. Cannabis, by the way, was actually used eventually to make ropes and fabrics and stuff like that. Its use as a drug only came much later. It says, "V'chelev zevachecha lo ervitani," and with the fat of your sacrifices you have not satisfied my thirst. Achavatani b'chatotecha, however you have made me burdened. You've made me work hard or burdened with your sins. Ugaatani b'avonotecha, you have made me weary with your iniquities. And now we see really the greater context of these verses. So then he says, however, Anochi hu mochef esha'echa lema'ani v'chatotecha lo ezko. However, I am, Anochi is the one. There's a very great emphatic structure here. Anochi hu mochef esha'echa lema'ani. He's making a point saying, it is I who is the one who wipes away your transgressions for my sake, lema'ani, for my sake. God says, you know what? I'm willing to let go of all of this. You're not going to have to do anything. I am going to remove your sin. V'chatotecha lo ezko, and your sins I will not remember. I will not remember them. I won't hold you accountable for them. This is a really interesting approach that Isaiah has. Ezekiel has something very similar as well, but Ezekiel is a bit more, with more strength behind what he says. But the idea is that God says, look, I know you are incapable. It's too difficult for you, but because I still see you as my people, I am going to forgive you everything that you have done. You don't have to do anything. Don't bring me sacrifices, don't do any actions. I'm doing this for my name's sake. So then he says here a verse that's a little bit difficult to understand. And he says here, Hazkireni nishfeta yachad saper ata leman tzdak. Mention me, which means mention my name. Because usually, because this relates, by the way, to the lo ezko in the previous verse, and now Hazkireni. So mention me, it probably means mention my name. Mention my name maybe in an oath, like in a trial, because this is really what he's saying. Let us join together. Let us nishfeta in a reflexive sense. We'll trial against one another. Saper ata leman tizdag. You tell your side, so you find yourself not guilty, vindicated. So it says, however, it won't help you. Because the truth is, Avicha rishon chata umilitzecha pash'uvi. Your first father sinned. This is something that goes back very, very early on in your behavior as a nation. And those who are the ones who speak in your favor, like advocates or spokesmen, have transgressed against me. He says, there's no way for you to get out of this. You are in your nature a stubborn people. And therefore, because of this, I have to act for my name's sake, so you can continue praising. But you need to pay attention. I'm doing this for you, so you can be my representatives on earth. And he says, Va'achalel sarei kodesh, and I have desecrated holy princes, probably talking about the priests. Ve'etena lecherem Yaakov v'Yisrael legidufim, and I placed Israel as cherem. Cherem is usually something that you seek to destroy completely. It's an ancient term that has to do with complete destruction. V'Yisrael legidufim, and Israel to mockery. The great kingdom of Israel is no more. Israel continuously suffered for many, many centuries over our iniquities. And he says, I had to punish you. So he's already talking about a reality of exile. But then Isaiah is mostly about hope. He always seeks hope. So Isaiah says here that even though in the state of destruction, there's still going to be some way of hope, some way of finding a way out of it. So he says in chapter 44, verse 1, Ve'ata shema Yaakov avdi, v'Yisrael bacharti vo. Now hear Jacob my servant, and Israel which I have chosen him. Now, it's a very interesting thing here, this whole subject of the servant. There's so much literature about this you wouldn't believe. In truth, in Isaiah, there's about 2 or 3 different servants. There's Israel the servant, there's the prophet the servant, and they might be a third servant, but that's very debatable. And for the last, I would say, 1800 years, people have been arguing who exactly is the servant. But here, very clearly, Yaakov avdi v'Yisrael b'charti vo, this is very, very clearly, this is specifically Israel. So he says to them, Ko amar Adonai osecha, thus says the Lord your Creator. Creator also means the one who owns you, the one who governs you. V'yotzercha mi beten ya'azreka, he who created you from the womb will help you. What's the point here of making this imagery of birth? Because we're talking here probably also about the idea of the rebirth of the people. If Ezekiel has his prophecy of the dry bones, Isaiah uses a lot of imagery that has to do with birthing. It's very interesting. They all have their own style. And it's very interesting how to parallel these prophecies of hope between Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. So Ezekiel derives a lot of his imagery from the idea of the dead and resurrecting the dead and impurity and so on. Isaiah derives a lot of his thoughts about desecrating God's name and then birth and the imagery of God as a father and mother and so on. So here, and I once did a recording of a couple of years ago about the end of the book of Isaiah, and there was a discussion there about the imagery of God as a mother, and I actually discovered that there is not only commentators that point this out, but also there's actually literature about this idea of God being both father and mother, and this is part of the objection to the imagery of Asherah, because the imagery of Asherah tries to point out the idea that there's sexuality and there's a male figure and a female figure and they're both separate from one another, and sexuality is completely removed from the Israelite temple. I've actually seen the argument this is why women don't serve in the temple. Unlike other temples in the ancient world, women don't serve in the temple to remove any element of sexuality. But there are also other reasons, because there's the issue of blood flow and so on that can make women unclean. With men, there's less of an issue. But one of the main points is really, it's not that women were not accepted. For example, so some of the bronze or copper used to build the tabernacle came from women, came specifically from the women, from their mirrors. They dedicated their mirrors, because they used to do polished polished bronze or copper, and they would use it as a mirror because it had reflective properties. And what happened is that women basically got removed because of this not wanting the worship of Asherah. Not necessarily that women bring Asherah in, but to remove the principle of sexuality. And therefore, this is why, for example, some of the arguments that say that the cherubs was one male, one female, I'm not sure of that, because of this problem of the Asherah and the sexuality principle that's being rejected here. We do find the bringing in of female imagery into the temple by wicked kings, but the truth be told, the monotheistic principle is that God is both father and mother simultaneously. So here, the imagery, by the way, right now is still masculine because the one who creates you from the womb, the idea was in the ancient world that and we know today biologically this is not correct, but the idea was that the man's seed goes into the womb and grows there. They didn't have this concept of the egg. So what they thought was that the seed goes in, and it sits there and turns into a human being. So here God is being presented as the man, as the masculine side. A very important note, by the way, is some people sometimes asking why I object to Kabbalah, and one of the reasons is because of the male-female imagery used there, which strongly parallels, in certain aspects, the idea of God having a female companion and so on. So someone once tried to narrow it down, the idea that I only object to the practical Kabbalah, which is basically a form of witchcraft, but it's a lot more complicated than that, and there's imagery there that raises a lot of questions, and this is why I object to it. So this is a good opportunity to bring this up. But we do find the idea of male and female, God being presented male and female. But in truth, is God male and female? We don't know. Most of the time he's presented as male because he's the protector, he's the leader, he's the king, he's the warrior, and so on. But we also find imagery as female, giving birth and nourishing and nurturing and so on. But sometimes Israel is presented as the bride, presented as the female side as well. But this is all imagery. This is all ideas. It doesn't necessarily. It's a metaphor to something. It's not that this is reality. Israel is human beings, both male and female. What exactly is the nature of God? We never really hear the nature of God. We only see the actions of God, and we, as this prophecy talks about, we go and tell the actions of God to raise the praise so people know He is a loyal God and keeps His promises. So He says in verse 2, Al tira avdi Yaakov v'yishurun bacharti vo. Do not fear my servant Jacob, and Yeshurun, which is a poetic form of Israel, which I have chosen him. For he says, Ki etzak mayim al tzameh v'nozlim al yabasha. For I pour water on that which is thirsty, which basically thirsty soil. How do I know it's soil? Because it says unozlim al yabasha, and liquids or rain on yabasha, which is from the word yavesh, dry land. But what's the metaphor here? Etzok ruchi al zarecha uvichati al tzetzarecha. I will pour my spirit. Ruchi here is obviously spirit. Upon your seed, zaracha here actually literally means the actual descendants, because a lot of people try to say it's spiritual descendants. That's not how it works in biblical Hebrew. There's no such thing as spiritual descendants. Zera usually means actual children, someone's actual descendants. And how do I know? Tzetzaecha, and my blessing upon your offsprings. So this is obviously actual people. He's saying, look, you might be in the exile, but your children, your grandchildren, they're going to see the hope. So it says, "V'tzamchu beven chatzir ka'aravim ali v'mayim." They will sprout out. Ben chatzir, beven chatzir, sounds a little bit weird, and it's a bit of a strange way of saying something. And some people say like grass between the hay. So chatzir is usually hay, but some people think there might be a bit of a mistake here, and the form might be kebin chatzir, like the son of grass, or basically like the grass, like the member of the family of the grass. There might be a mistake in the Masoretic text here. The Septuagint, as far as I know, and the Great Isaiah Scroll, the first one, because there's two. It seems to be like the son of grass, ka'aravim aliv le'mayim, like willows, like the arava, aravim, aravot. It's an interesting thing. Switch here, because usually we see aravot, but here it says aravim aliv le'mayim on the flows of water, on the water courses. And then he says in verse 5, Zeyomar, so this is a really, really interesting verse, and there's a lot of controversy around it. It says, Zeyomar la'adonayani. This will say, I am to the Lord. One declares, I belong to the Lord, to Yud Hei Vav Hei. V'zei kareh b'shem Yaakov, and this will be named Jacob. Now, we don't exactly know who he's talking about. Some people think that this might be about the nations. Some people think that these are people that he's still talking about Israel, and therefore they're going to openly declare who they are. And now this is the most controversial part. V'zei yichtov yado la'Adonai, u'v'shem Yisrael yechaneh. This one will write his hand to the Lord, and under the name of Israel he will be named. He will be called. So if these are Israelites, then these are Israelites who openly declare who they are. If these are non-Israelites, and these are people of the nations who want to join. The problem is that we don't really see a change in the antecedent here. So there's a big question if this is really people from the nations, as a lot of commentators try to go. But the big controversy is the V'zei yichtov yado la'Adonai. Tattooing in the book of Leviticus is forbidden. This is Leviticus 19. I've actually written about this, that there's no evidence that people would write the names of their gods in their hand in earlier stages of history, but it was more a way of marking people slaves. And we actually have there's Huningaren wrote an article about this a couple of years ago. I think it was 2014 or something. His name is Huningard, I think, something like that. He's mostly known for his work on languages and Akkadian and so on, but he's a Bible scholar as well. And he actually wrote an article about this that explains that tattooing was more a way of marking a slave. So there's some doubt here if this is really talking about tattooing your hand, because there's a very popular thing these days to tattoo in your hand to the Lord. I've actually seen people do it. I remember riding the light rail in Jerusalem, and there was a man standing there, obviously from the United States, because he spoke English with an American accent, and he had on his arm to the Lord, Lamed to Yud Hei Vav Hei. And the problem is that this is might not necessarily be what the Torah, what Isaiah is talking about. This actually might be a dedication of action. The same way that, for example, it says you'll bind them as a sign on your arm, really means that you'll dedicate your actions. Your deeds are always going to be symbolic. Your deeds are always going to be in direction of doing something to honor God. So it's more of a symbolic interpretation. So there's a lot. I have a lot of doubt if this is really about tattooing, even though there are commentators go in this direction and say what he's talking about is tattoo. I personally have my doubts. But if we're talking about people from the nations who are not necessarily bound to Torah law, they're only affiliating. Maybe in that case it will be allowed. But I have some suspicion here also especially because. Because we are Mamlechet Kohanim V'Goy Kadosh, the same way a priest is not allowed to have any cuts on his face, not allowed to destroy his beard. Israelites are forbidden to do certain actions of cutting oneself, which also has to do with tattooing, because tattooing has to do with permanent marking and deformation of the body. Even though it can be very pretty, you're still cutting the skin. You can actually watch videos of high definition, slow motion imagery of what happens when you use a tattoo needle, and you can see how it cuts into the skin. So this is cutting. It's actually cutting. This is a prohibition of the Torah. So I have a lot of doubt about the interpretation that this has to do with tattooing that's presumably allowed. Now we get to one of my favorite verses in the entire Tanakh, where this is Isaiah 44 verse 6. Ko amar Adonai melech Yisrael v'go'alo Adonai Tzva'ot Ani Rishon v'ani Acharon u'bel'adai en Elohim. Thus says the Lord, King of Israel, his Redeemer, their Redeemer, Go'alo, his Redeemer. It's actually in the singular. You translate as their Redeemer. YHWH of hosts, I am first and I am last, and there is no God but me, or besides me there is no other God. One of the most powerful verses, I think, in the entire Bible, equivalent to the Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. The idea is that God says, there's only me. This is something we hear in Isaiah over and over again. Isaiah mocks idol worshipping. He mocks the idea of other gods. He mocks all paganism and everything. He says, God, the Lord, YHWH, is the King of Israel, his Redeemer. He is first, he is last, and there is no other God. First and last, by the way, also means that there's nothing else that can exist. He is one, and that's it. There's nothing else, which is a very, very powerful statement in a very, very pagan world. And he says, "Umi chamoni yikra v'yagideh v'yarcheh li misumi am olam v'otiot v'asher tavon yagidu lamo." It says, who is like me who can call out or announce and will say it? Okay, it can basically foretell it and can match to what I have said. Even as he says, misumi amolam, even as I told the future, or placed, actually. It's an interesting question what exactly translates misumi here. Some people say, even as I told the future to an ancient people, which is probably a correct translation. Because misumi, what have I placed? The words said earlier, to an ancient people. The otiot is actually the signs. It's like the word otot. It's another version of the word otot, otiot. V'asher tavon yagidu lamon, that which will come, the future. They will say to them. Lamo is a very interesting thing. It can be to him or to they. It's a pronoun, it's a poetic pronoun that can be translated either as single or plural. It says, Al tefahadu v'al tirhu. So this is an interesting dialectal issue here. Do not fear and do not be frightened and not be shaken. Tirhu might be actually come from the word tir'u, which is another way to say fear. But some people actually argue that the tirhu is correct. You have to replace hey with aleph here, and some people might relate to the Arabic root wariha, which means to be stricken with fear. Halo me'az, you said, because you have to trust me. Halo me'az shishma'aticha ve'gati vatem idai. From earlier, from me'az, from forever, I have made you hear, and I have told you, and you are my witnesses. Israel, you are my witnesses. You can say this was foretold. Hayesh Eloah mi bal adai ve'ensur bal yadati. Is there any other God besides me? Is there any rock, tzul, that I do not know? Or maybe he says, is there any other rock? I know none. There is no one else. Because the idea of Hatzur Tamim Po'alo, you go back to Deuteronomy, Hatzur Tamim Po'alo, ki kol dercha mishpat, ele munah ven avel tzadik ve'asharu. The Hatzur Tamim Po'alo, the rock whose all his deeds are unblemished. And now he starts mocking the pagan gods. Yotzre fesel kulam tohu v'hamudeim bal yo'ilo. Those who produce the worksmen, the craftsmen who make the statues, it's all vanity. It's all with no purpose, and all the things that they treasure do not help them. V'adehem hemma bal yiru val yid'u leman yevoshu. And the adi here, it's adehem can also mean their witnesses. There's a double entendre here. I would say there's double meaning where adi can be something that you wear as a piece of jewelry, but also can play off the word of witnesses. They're witnesses. V'adem hemma. This actually has 3 dots on top because hey mem hey. There are 3 dots over each one of the letters, which might indicate the idea that the word is not supposed to be there. It's an old way of marking. You have to erase this. But he says there, and their witnesses, they cannot see and they cannot know, so in order that they will be shamed. You have to understand, this is shameful. These gods, quote unquote, can't really help you with anything. So he asks a rhetorical question: Mi yatzar el ufesa nasach levilti oil? Who has made a god and a statue he has poured, because you were talking about casting the metal, that cannot do good, does not help. Hen kol chaverav yivoshu, all the ones who assembled together to do this are shamed. V'charashim hema me'adam, and these are from craftsmen, from humans. Yitkabtzu chulam ya'amodu yifahadu yivoshu yahad. They will all gather together and stand. Stand might be an issue of standing to trial, and they will fear and be shamed together. Those who do all the actions, including all the ones to the end of the process where they buy it and put the statue in their temple. Charash barzel ma'atzad ufa'al b'peham u'makavot yitzero, the craftsman of the iron, charash barzel, the one who works the blacksmith with his tools, a ma'atzad. There might be some kind of hammer or something. Not very clear to me exactly what the ma'atzad here is. It's a type of hammer of some sort. This verse is considered to be a little bit difficult, but it really comes from the blacksmith who uses his hammer, who worked who works with the charcoal, with basically the production of fire. B'makavot yitzero, with hammers they produce it. Ve'fa'aluhu bezroa kocho, and they produce them with the strength of their own arm. It's supposed to be a god, but you're using your own strength to make it. Gam ra'ev ve'en koach lo shata mayim vayaf. However, when he is hungry, he has no strength, and when he does not drink water, he becomes thirsty. He grows faint from thirst. It says charash etzim nataka v'tareu v'serad. The carpenter, the charash etzim, the craftsman of the wood, natakav, he measures it with a line. They had measuring tools that they would use. Yita'areu besered, and he marked it with probably with maybe a stylus or something. Not very clear what the sered is. Ya'aseu b'maktsu'ot. He will produce it with a scraping. If you've ever seen how you do woodwork, you actually have this scraper where you start smoothing out the wood first of all. And I would actually say basered is probably more probably some kind of like a pencil that we use today. He does a marking. And then he starts marking up the sections with a machuga, which is basically a compass or some kind of rounding tool. V'yasel ketavnit ish, and he made him like the image of a man. Ki tiferet adam lashevet bait, the beauty of a man who dwells in a shrine. Bait here is he's supposed to sit in the shrine. Lichot lo arazim, to cut down for himself cedar. Ve'kach tirza va'alon, and he took plane trees. Tirza, again, as I've always said in previous recordings, it's very difficult to sometimes identify all the different trees which are mentioned in these different sources. This might be some kind of pine wood, might be tirza, and alon is obviously oak. Vayametz lo ba'atzayar, and he Ya'ametz here, some people translate as he sets aside. Amatz here also can be to work hard in the forest, but also it might be that he's checking the pieces of the trees. He's checking what's better to be used. Nata oren vegeshem egader, and he also plants the pine. You can, instead of just going to the forest, might actually plant the tree itself, and the rain comes down, something completely out of his control, and the tree grows. But this is somehow supposed to be a god. The mockery here is that really everything about these statues is really outside the power of the statue. The statue doesn't make itself. Okay, and then the mockery continues. Vayal adam levael, will be for man to make fire. Veikach mehem vayecham, he took from this wood and he warms. Afi yasik va'afalachem, even he stokes the stove and bakes bread. However, afif al el vayishtachu, however, he also makes a god that he bows down. Vayishtachu here sometimes translated as worship, but here means to bow down. This is your source of food, and you're making. I remember I once saw this really, really funny cartoon where there's a man who's looking at a pear tree, and he looks at the tree, and then he chops it down. He makes a statue out of it, and then he prays to the statue. He wants a pear to eat, and this is part of the mockery here. You produce your own food, but then you turn around to it and you say, "I want food from you." Asau Fesed vayizgod lamo. He made him into a statue, and he bowed down to it. And he says, this is the stupidity, verse 16. Chetzio saraf b'mo'esh. Half of it he burnt in fire. Al chetzio basar yochel, and half of it he ate meat. He roasted meat. Yitzlet seli vayisba. He roasted a roast and he satisfied himself. Af yechom. Also he made warmth for himself. Vayomer ha'ach chamoti ra'iti ur. This is wonderful. I've seen heat and seen fire. The rest of it he made for his statue. He worshipped it and bowed down to it and prayed to it. And he said, "Save me, for you are my God." By the way, notice I translate pronouns here, which usually mean to him, but because there's no it in Hebrew, I translate this as it, even though the direct translation would be to him, but we're talking about an it here. So he says, this is folly. Lo yad'u v'lo yavinu. They don't know and do not understand. This is stupidity. Kitach mira'ot einehem haskil libotam. For their eyes are shut closed from seeing, from allowing their hearts to understand. V'lo yashiv el libo. And he would not return to his heart. He make his heart understand. V'lo da'at v'lo tvuna lemo. With no knowledge and no understanding, saying, Chatzio sarafti mo'esh, the irony. Half of it I burnt with b'mo'esh, with fire. V'afafiti al gechalav lechem, and I even baked upon its coals bread. Etzlev asar va'ochel, I roasted meat and ate. V'yitro le'to'eva, and the rest of it I've done for an abomination. Levul etz esgod, to a block of wood I worship. So he says, Roe efer levhutal hitau. So he's a shepherd of ashes, because the word turns into ashes. Lev hutali tao, a deluded mind, a deluded heart, because the heart was the place of thought. A deluded heart has gone astray. Velo yatzilet nafsho velo yomar halo sheker be'yamini. He does not save his own soul and does not say, for a lie is in my right hand. I am holding a lie here. So he says to them, Zechor ele Yaakov Israel ki avdi ata. Remember all of these, Jacob and Israel, for you are my servant. He says, remember how stupid this all is. But I have created you, and you have seen my deeds, and you have seen how I have saved you multiple times. Yetzarticha eved li ata. I have created you. You have not created me. I have created you. You are my servant. Israel lo tanisheni. Israel, you will not abandon me. Because he says, Mahiti cha'av pesha'echa. I have wiped away like a cloud your sins, either like rain that washes the earth, or as a cloud that dissolves in the wind. V'cha'anan chatotecha, like a cloud your iniquities or transgressions. Shuva elayki ge'alticha, return to me, for I have redeemed you. All he says is just return to me. I will forgive you everything that you have done. Just return to me. And he ends this with a beautiful statement about reality. The moment we return to God, all reality returns to itself, and all reality becomes whole again and perfect again. And he says, Ronu shamayim ki asa Adonai, hariu tahtiot aretz, pitzchu harim rina, ya'ar v'chol etz bo, ki ga'al Adonai Yaakov u'Yisrael yitpa'ar. It says, rejoice heavens, for the Lord has done. Call out the bottoms of the earth. Break forth with song mountains, the forest and all the wood, all the trees which are in it. For the Lord has redeemed Israel and has redeemed Jacob, and in Israel he has glorified himself. Such powerful words. God says, look, I want you to be my people. All you have to do is forfeit these wrong things that you have done. You don't have to do anything else. Abandon the folly, abandon the vanity, abandon all the stupidity, abandon these pagan gods, just return to me, and everything will be fine. I will forgive you all your iniquities. I don't need sacrifices, I don't need the blood, I don't need any of this. Just return to me, and I will accept you. I hope you enjoyed this recording. I think it's a very powerful reading with a beautiful ending. And may we return to him with all our hearts so we can see the earth rejoice back into its earliest state where everything is perfect. Kol Tov.